Okay, how you doing everyone? Welcome to this final lecture for this module, the Paralympic athlete. We're going to conclude our discussion on additional considerations when working with Paralympic athletes, and we're going to talk today about psychological considerations. So again, this is just a broad strokes overview of some psychological considerations, things to be aware of, so if you're working as part of a multidisciplinary team, that you can be as effective as possible. So here's a quote. Here it is known as the disability paradox. Why do many people with serious and persistent disabilities report that they experience a good or excellent quality of life when, to most external observers, these people seem to live an undesirable daily experience? So, people without disabilities tend to believe that a disability is negatively impacting on the life quality of the person with the disability. However, many people with impairments indicate that they have a great quality of life. As we said, this is known as the disability paradox, and it's an important concept for coaches to be familiar with. Assuming that an athlete with an impairment has a poor quality of life simply because of their disability is incorrect. So as a coach, you should treat your athlete with an impairment the same way that you would treat any other athlete or person. As we've said numerous times, person first, athlete first, disability second. In terms of coping with a disability, about 15% of the athletes that you probably deal with will have a congenital disability and will have not experienced life without disability. So a congenital disability is something that they've had from birth, so they don't know any different. This is their life. They will not know anything other than life with their disability. Most athletes, about 85%, will have an acquired disability as a result of a serious traumatic injury or illness. Now, this sudden and permanent injury or change to their physical being because of an injury or illness may significantly disrupt psychological well-being, and a coach should always keep this in mind. So be mindful, be considerate of the stage that athlete is at in relation to the onset of their disability. Is it something that happened years ago when they were a child, or is it something that has been relatively recent? So in my experience working with athletes, I have some athletes who have congenital disabilities, they were born with it. Athletes who suffered illnesses or trauma when they were a young child and had an injury that was life-changing. Or we have athletes who may have experienced something when they were older, teenage years, or as an adult, a traumatic illness or injury that has resulted in them having a permanent physical impairment. So bear those things in mind and be mindful of them when dealing with your athletes. As we've said there, the people who have acquired disability, this may significantly disrupt their psychological well-being, but this doesn't have to be a permanent disruption to their psychological well-being. Self-esteem is a term used to describe how we view our own worth as a person. It's often believed that individuals with impairments may experience low self-esteem. However, research has indicated that there are no self-esteem differences between para-athletes and able-bodied athletes. Positive self-esteem is, something hopefully we'll have all experienced, and it may be based on successful experiences that promote feelings of mastery, being good at something, and favourable judgments of values from significant others. So sport is obviously a good opportunity to boost your self-esteem if you feel like you are learning a new skill, if you perform well in that skill and are judged to have performed well by others around you. That can boost your self-esteem. So obviously on that, para-athletes, able-bodied athletes, anyone, sport can boost their self-esteem to similar degrees. It doesn't, whether you are a para-athlete or an able-bodied athlete doesn't come into it. In terms of building self-esteem, here's a couple of notes from the International Paralympic Committee Academy, that education portal that we mentioned. So first of all, you want to maximise the positive and minimise the negative with your athletes, focusing on their abilities and not their limitations. Everybody, para or able-bodied athlete, will have abilities and limitations. So this is not to say that you don't acknowledge that they have a disability or some limitations. The same way with an able-bodied athlete, you might acknowledge that they might have a weakness in their game and a limitation. But rather by focusing on and developing their abilities, you can make them feel good about all the things that they can do, the same as you would with an able-bodied athlete. Number 2 there, avoid unrealistic comparisons. Don't get caught up in comparing apples and oranges. Everyone has both strengths and limitations, and this is especially true for team sports where athletes have different impairments. So back to that CP soccer, you wouldn't compare in an able-bodied team, you wouldn't be likely to go comparing athletes to athletes, and especially not in a 7-a-side cerebral palsy team, because each individual on that has an individual impairment and level of ability. So comparisons are not going to be helpful in these situations. Set realistic goals together with your athlete. So as a coach, one of your objectives will be sit down and work with your athlete to create realistic goals in terms of performances and outcomes. This may mean allowing and taking extra time with the athletes to learn and integrate new skills into what they're doing. Things might take a little bit longer, but if you set realistic goals with your athletes that are not just based on outcome, based on performance as well, then you will be more successful and help to boost their self-esteem. Number 4, don't overgeneralize. If there's something that your athlete cannot do as a result of his or her impairment, it is wrong to conclude that they are an overall failure. There are other positives that can be taken from certain situations and certain outcomes. Number 5, avoid getting caught up in should statements. For example, don't tell your athlete you should be able to finish this task in 30 seconds like everyone else in the team. This should statement may not be accurate. It may not be reflective of their ability. So accommodations and learning about your athletes takes time, and give them a bit of leeway on tests, and make sure that you use tools to create equal and level playing fields when it comes to testing of your athletes, and give opportunities to the athletes to show you what they can do. Finally, appreciate your athletes. I think all of these are just common sense approaches, but appreciate your athletes, appreciate their abilities and their limitations, focus on the positive aspects by relating these limitations to their ability to perform. One way to do it is by specifying their coping strategies with challenging situations. So overcome any limitations by developing positive coping strategies and mechanisms for the athletes to help maximize their performance on the field or in their sport, or to help overcome any other obstacles that they may be facing. And again, that's true for able-bodied athletes as well. A good coach should appreciate your athletes. You should avoid getting caught up using should statements. You shouldn't overgeneralize. You should set realistic goals, avoid unrealistic comparisons, and focus on your athletes' abilities, not their limitations. This is good general advice for a coach with all athletes. It's not specific to para-athletes. Self-efficacy and self-confidence. Para-athletes must feel confident in their abilities to perform consistently and successfully. So they need to be able to feel confident in themselves. Self-confidence specifically represents an athlete's beliefs that they can be successful in their sport, and self-efficacy reflects the athlete's beliefs that their ability to execute a skill or to obtain a particular outcome are sufficient. So they're intricately linked but slightly different there. Coaches should focus on controllable personal performance goals. So don't focus on winning or losing. Don't focus on the outcome. Focus on personal controllable performance goals, things that are in your sphere of control there to help boost self-efficacy and self-confidence. So focus on the task, not the outcome. Employ positive, helpful self-talk and minimize negative, efficacy-destroying self-talk. So reinforce positive self-talk and try and eliminate any negative self-talk. Motivation is the driving force behind an athlete's desire and determination to achieve their goal. So athletes need to be need to have a certain level of motivation in order to work towards the bigger goal that they may have. Para-athletes potentially have greater mastery orientated motivation. So that is mastery is defined as having the goal of learning and mastering the task according to self-set standards. The learner in this case is focused on developing new skills, improving and acquiring a definite knowledge. They are not focused on the outcome That's their orientation is on the task at hand, not the outcome. Again, this is good advice for all athletes, but as the research states there, para-athletes may be potentially more mastery orientated than able-bodied athletes. And typically, recommendations for coaches involved in parasport is just to follow the guidelines and strategies that they would use with any athlete. You don't have to make any major modifications here when it comes to working with para athletes. Athletic identity. This is an important one to consider when it comes to the psychology. It's often questioned whether the public view para athletes as legitimate athletes. So, think about it yourself. Just take a second to think about the athletes who compete in the Paralympics, and in your head compare them to the athletes who compete in the Olympics. Do you consider it equal? We go back to that first lecture. Paralympics, equal, parallel, Paralympics. So it's parallel, equal in splendour, equal in competition. The athletes are on a level playing field and competing at an elite standard. Do you view it that way? Do you know people who may not view it that way? And the reality is there are probably people out there who view it differently. Heinrich Poppau is a German sprinter. At the 2012 Games in London, he won gold in the 100-metre sprint in his specific sports class. And he says, I think only others believe it is special. I want to reach my goals. I think that it makes all athletes the same. We all want to win. It does not really matter how many legs or arms an athlete has. In sport, my performance should be most important. Participants in both groups, able-bodied and parasport, both report strong levels of athletic identity. There's comparable profiles in both sports. Athletes with a disability see themselves as an athlete to the same extent as able-bodied athletes do. There is very little difference in how they identify as an athlete. Para-athletes have been suggested to cope much better with failure and illness as they put their athletics achievements in perspective to the more significant challenges that they may face owing to their impairment or their disability. But the key message here is that there's a very, very strong athletic identity in both able-bodied and para-athletes, and that should be appreciated and fostered. Again, we come back to it all the time. The coach should focus on athletic goals and ability, not the athlete's disability. Stress is again another important thing for all athletes. And there's many sources of stress experienced by athletes, but there's some research here to look at athletes specific to para-athletes and sources of stress that they have. So these are research that was carried out in elite male wheelchair basketball athletes, and they identified the following sources of stress for them. Pre-competition issues, so things like, am I going to get selected from the team? Negative competition readiness, for example, being concerned about broken equipment or equipment that's not up to scratch. Performance worries, how much playing time are they going to get? Post-match performance concerns, like if they play badly, how is that going to play out after the match? The downside the downside of participating in a major competition, being away from home. That's something I identified as a source of stress for me when I discussed the travel there, the amount of travel that's involved in working with high performance sports. Low group cohesiveness, so being anxious or stressed about conflict with teammates. Negative remarks about coaching, so not enough encouragement from the coach or poor relationships with the coach. Relationship worries, personal relationship worries, so concerns about their partner's well-being, particularly when they're away from home, or if the athlete has to dedicate so much time to training and performance that their relationships are not being tended to. And then sports demands, so things like limited funds for expensive equipment, funding for travel, there's lots of issues that come in there. So, this is just one set of research from that one group of athletes, but you'll find that there are multiple sources of stresses for all athletes, but that there's commonality amongst them. So what we want to do as service providers or as coaches is try to minimize those sources of stress or mitigate against them. So have plans in place to minimize the impact that these stresses may have on the athlete. Identify them, plan to overcome them, minimize the impact that they have on the athlete. Major causes of stress. Athletes, for specific to para athletes again, athletes may be classified. So going through the classification process multiple times during their career is a major source of stress. Typically, athletes will be classified in the run up to major competitions, which is already a stressful time in the preparation for competition. And the outcome is that athletes could be reclassified, which means that they might it could affect their chances of winning. Now, the IPC have vowed to try and minimise the impact of this on athletes and the chances of this happening. However, this is a major source of stress for para athletes. So in here, the coach's role is to have a thorough understanding of the classification procedure in their sport. Coaches should be with their athletes throughout the process and be present for the classification and act as a mentor before, during and after the classification process. In terms of sports psychology and preparation for major competitions like the Paralympic Games, there are common issues again faced by athletes at the Paralympic Games. So things like accessibility concerns in a foreign country, they may have disability or medical concerns about access to medical facilities while they're abroad, or when we were travelling to China, in particular, it stood out, access just in general around the place. So getting around as a person with a physical impairment was more challenging because they don't have the same infrastructure as they might have in other countries. Again, disability classification, as we've mentioned. Team cohesion is a big one. So para athletes often train on their own or with local teams when compared to Olympic athletes. Now, this is not true in Ireland. You'll have heard me mention many times about multi-sport camps, and Paralympics Ireland for the last 4 cycles have really focused in on that Team Ireland mentality, bringing the athletes together so there's strong team cohesiveness. However, if you're working in a different country, things may be different. Confidence, concentration, focus, motivation, staying positive. These are all things that may affect the athletes when they are away competing at major competitions. There are some good papers available there. 2 of them are linked, and they'll all be available in the additional resources pack for this part of the module. So, summing up, psychological support is essential. Sports psychologists can help Paralympians or para-athletes develop mental skills to manage the unique stressors of competitions like the Paralympics to increase the odds of having a superior performance. And again, with Paralympics Ireland, for since 2006, since before the Beijing cycle, and I think for the Sydney cycle before that, there has always been a sports psychologist on board. They are probably ahead of the curve in Ireland with that. There's always been a sports psychologist integrated with the team to help the athletes to try and maximise their performance. And we would work, as a physiologist, I would have worked, not as closely as I would have with other service providers, but I would have interacted with the psychologist, again, just to help them to work more effectively with the athlete and to help the athlete work more effectively. So it's a two-way street there, everyone working together to make sure there's open channels of communication to get the most out of everyone. Okay, that's it. That's the final lecture for this module. Thank you very much for your attention all the way through. I hope you enjoyed the module, and as always, if you have any questions now or in the future, please do not hesitate to get in touch with me. That's it. I won't catch you in the next one because there is no more lectures.